Good morning, noon, or night, wherever and whenever you are listening to The Shift. This is the August 21st, 2017 edition. If you like what you're hearing, please think about becoming a patron. That's patreon.com/The Shift. If you want to find out more, go to my Facebook page at The Shift with Doug McKenty. Join the conversation on Twitter at DMcKenty, or take a look at my archives at www.theshiftnow.com. Today is the 10th episode of The Shift. My guest on the program today is Joe Atwill, author of the controversial book Caesar's Messiah. In this work, Atwill compares and contrasts the books of the Gospel and the New Testament with another well-known work of antiquity entitled The War Against the Jews by the famous historian of the time, Josephus. Utilizing a deep understanding of the Roman and Jewish literature of the period, Joe Atwill is able to posit the theory that the Gospels, rather than depicting an accurate history of the story of the true Messiah, is in actuality a satirical allegory intentionally inflicted upon the Jewish people at the time as a form of Roman propaganda, with the specific purpose of tricking them into accepting the Roman Caesar Titus Flavius as their one true Lord and Savior. Though the thesis seems incredible, Caesar's Messiah comes replete with example after example from primary source material that renders this conclusion difficult to dispute. Atwill has gone on to work with blogger and podcaster Jan Irvin at gnosticmedia.com, co-writing articles such as The Manufacturing of a Deadhead and Gregory Batesman and the Counterculture, theorizing that the elite class continues to engage in this type of social engineering disseminated by Roman emperors so many thousands of years ago. Find out more at CaesarsMessiah.com. Joe Atwill, welcome to the program, and thanks for helping to make the shift.
Hey, thanks for having me, Doug.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what a controversial topic, but what I think for me actually a great part of making the shift, because coming to the knowledge that this type of patriarchal religion, I mean, for me, for a long time, I've had the suspicion that it is just a type of propaganda that basically trains people to accept authority, government authority figures in their lives doing what they're told. It's kind of maybe a tool of empire, if you will. Can you talk about just the general theory of, patriarchal religion, how you started thinking about getting into this? What made you want to look at the Gospels and the New Testament in this way?
I grew up in Japan. My family was one of the first non-military families in the country after the war. There was nowhere for me to go to school except for a place called St. Mary's Military Academy. It was run by and organized by what's called the Christian Brothers. My immediate teachers were Jesuits in the course of the years, and they were very interested in training people in basically having knowledge of the Gospels. So my whole early childhood was spent almost every day studying the Gospels. And later in life, I fell away. I wasn't really interested in religion. It wasn't some kind of denunciation of Catholicism. It was just I just sort of lost interest in it as a faith. But I always kept kind of the intellectual curiosity about Jesus and sort of the history of that era, because I'd had so much experience in it as a kid. And later in life, there was this controversy that swirled around the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were these ancient documents that had been discovered, at Qumran, and they were from the general era of Jesus's ministry, but they described a completely different kind of Messiah, one that was a warrior. And this really piqued my curiosity. I really was not familiar with the Jewish war. And I certainly wasn't familiar and had never been taught about other messianic movements of this era, particularly one that may have been militaristic. And it just occurred to me that these two movements just seemed unlikely to have sprung from the same region at the same time. So I began to study the scrolls, and, logical to the Torah, the Messiah that they described was a military leader. And their relationship to Rome would have been basically one of a colony in opposition to the colonizer. So there was enmity toward Rome and to all foreigners that was expressed inside the religious literature that the scrolls presented. And so then the Gospels seemed very suspicious to me. I mean, how did this come about? This organization, and I realized that I really didn't understand the history of the era well. So I started to read the only historian of the first century of Judea, and that's Flavius Josephus. And when I went through his history, trying to have just a more informed opinion about the first century religious life in Judea, I started noticing really oddball parallels, sort of seeming connections or typology, kind of relationships between events that Josephus was describing and the stories I remembered being taught as a boy. And so that then just became a focus. I tried to understand why there was this relationship between the two works. And then one day, it just occurred to me that everything was occurring in the same sequence. And so at that point, I realized that I wasn't, just seeing some, flavoring that ended up, and as part of the author's perspective in the Gospels. It was much deeper. And so then I just started studying that position. And I realized basically that Jesus was created out of this military campaign that this set or family of Roman Caesars had conducted in Judea. And that basically, the way you can understand the Gospels is with the premise that the victors write history. And with the Gospels, they simply wrote it as a prophecy of their military victories. So everything that Jesus describes is a military victory of the Flavian Caesar family. But then beyond that, they even wired all of the little details of his life into events from the military campaign, so that when you lay the two works side by side, and this is just the sort of different quality of evidence that I bring to an understanding of the Gospels, is that when you just roll out the Gospels in a sequence, just the relationships, one event after another, as the authors described them in the ministry of Jesus, and then do the same thing to the military campaign that Josephus described, then you can see that that the basic core events that are they're not controversial, things like Jesus will predict the crushing of the Galileans' towns, and this is a historical event. This actually occurs in the war. Mm-hmm. Jesus predicts that the city of Jerusalem will be encircled, and again, this is a historical event. Josephus records it. Jesus predicts the temple will be razed, and again, a historical event. Jesus predicts the abomination of desolation that Daniel prophesies will come to pass, and Josephus records this. So when you look at these kind of milestone historical events, which there's not any controversy about, you can see they're occurring in the same sequence, both in the in the two ministries, the Titus Flavius, the military leader, and of Jesus Christ, the character in the Gospels. And then when you start actually detail sequencing, where you take smaller events and try to place them in the same order, you can see that both stories are really basically representation of the same story. It's just the one in the Gospels is written as a prophecy, both a direct prophecy, or Jesus will simply have a behavior or make a statement about something which will be related to an event that Josephus recorded at that point in the military campaign. I hope that's not complicated, but that's the general process I went through and what the theory is.
Sure. I mean, it is crazy because as you're reading the book, Caesar the Messiah, you realize that it becomes too much to be coincidental. Event after event from both of the works, you're quoting the primary sources, and it's like, wow. I mean, Josephus is really talking about this specific event. It's in the New Testament, and it's easy to do the comparison and contrast. Can you tell us a little bit about Josephus himself and who he was and what his relationship was with the emperor's court, the Caesar's court, because he, as a Jewish person himself, knew all kinds of, very advanced Jewish, almost a Jewish prophet, I think he's been described, and then began working with the Roman court. Just talk about his history and how he ended up, the kind of work he was doing.
He's one of the most important historians in Western civilization. I mean, he's the one who creates all of the context that we understand the Gospels with. But he's an extremely bizarre individual. As he purports, he starts out in life as an extremely religious Jew. He claims that at one time or another in his life, he was a member of all three of the major sects of Judaism in this era, the Essenes, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees. He claims to be from the royal family, the Hasmonean priest family that was, running the Maccabean kingdom at this time. But he also is a cosmopolitan. He knows, for example, the wife of Nero. He goes to Rome and he's received there. So he has 2 feet, a foot in each world, one in kind of this zealot Jewish world and the other in this kind of cosmopolitan international world that Rome dominates. The Jewish War, which was a rebellion, a messianic rebellion against Rome. In other words, what really propelled it into existence was the belief in the coming of a Messiah. This rebellion broke out in 66 CE, and according to Josephus, he was given command over the military campaign that they waged against Rome in Galilee. So he says that he was basically the general of the messianic army in Galilee. He was captured by the Flavians, and at this time the Flavian family had not seized the throne. But Josephus basically went to Vespasian, who was the father of the 2 sons. He was the first of the Flavian Caesars. And Josephus said, you're going to become Caesar. I can see it. I'm a prophet. They didn't believe Josephus. However, this came to pass.
Wow. So
they then said, well, this guy is a prophet. He's useful. They brought him into the fold. He became basically a turncoat. Mm-hmm. He assisted Rome against the Jewish Messianic movement. And then following the war, they brought him back to Rome, got him a wife, gave him a townhouse in the emperor's palace, and asked him to write the official version of the war. And so this then became what's known to history as War of the Jews. And that book has always been associated with the sort of the origins of Christianity, because the prophecies that Jesus makes about the future were understood as having been correct and having come to pass because Josephus recorded them. In other words, and so that at the kind of the beginning of the Christian religion, you have copies of the New Testament that actually contain the works of Josephus, because it was just seen as kind of the same intellectual understanding that Jesus makes, the prophet, the Son of God, makes the predictions. The historian Josephus recorded the fact, proving that Jesus was divine. So that was the general understanding. Christian theology had this school called the Preterites, which was basically this understanding that Jesus made predictions and they all came to pass in the Roman-Jewish War. And Josephus was the historian that recorded all those events. So Josephus has always been wired into Christianity. My work just shows that it was just quite a bit deeper than anyone had imagined.
Mm-hmm. And Josephus had this concept, I think, that the God of the Jews came to favor the Romans, right? Is there, and so there is evidence that he was actually intentionally attempting to shift this kind of Father God, this monotheistic God into the Roman situation. And there are other, just explain, I think, to the audience a little bit how the Roman Caesars would call themselves God, and they had this practice of trying to assimilate. If they conquered another culture, they would always assimilate their gods. And then at a certain point in time, they had hundreds of gods that they had assimilated. And it to me, it was a logical conclusion to come to that Josephus maybe was like, well, hey, could we construct one of these religions? Because there were every Roman emperor had a religion and a cult constructed around them, so they had experience with creating religions like this. That maybe they could contemplate creating a religion with a monotheistic God that could ultimately be the Roman unification church that could unify the entire empire under one new God, this Jewish God that they assimilated into the empire through, the philosophy of Josephus.
Yeah, the Caesars would adopt the identities of the local gods of the areas that they conquered. When Vespasian was considering becoming Caesar, he went into the temple of Seriphus. He was in Alexandria, which is in Egypt at this time, and there was a word that Nero had died, and he was supposedly questioning about whether or not he should try to make a play for the throne. So he goes into the temple of Seriphus, and he comes out and he says, "You know what? I am Seriphus." He says, "I am the god." Mm-hmm. And then he works a couple miracles just to prove it. So this was just routine propaganda. I mean, if you look at the pharaohs becoming the man god, right. The oligarchs had at this point in human development this technique about the adoption of the identity of a god, which would basically make them easier to obey, and so the idea that it was sort of not to be expected for Rome to try to take basically the mantle of the human divinity that represents the Jews to the supreme being is basically silly. In other words, they of course they would have looked at this and tried to have studied it and see what they could do to basically manipulate the religion. Rome had been trying to manipulate the Jewish religion since they had conquered it with Pompey, I think 166 BCE. So they'd had this long history of trying to they had this long history of trying to basically control the religion. Mm-hmm. And the Flavians basically were aligned with the premier Jewish intellectual family at that time, which was the Alexanders. People are aware of Philo. He's the famous philosopher and Jewish theologian. He was the best known author. Well, Philo's brother was the father of Tiberius Alexander. And Tiberius Alexander, when his father died, became the richest individual in the world because his father was the albarch, or the tax collector of the area of Egypt. He was Rome's tax collector. Mm-hmm. So Tiberius was Jewish, had an intellectual background in Judaism. I mean, his uncle was the most famous theologian of the era. But he was completely aligned with Rome's interests because the family generated their enormous wealth through Roman taxation. And they hated the Messianic movement because this was just a way they would lose money, as they would see it. So, right. So when the war broke out, Tiberius then came over to the Flavians and worked as their premier general. When Vespasian went to Rome, he left his son Titus in charge of the army and placed Tiberius basically as the head general under Titus. So this family was completely aligned. Now, this is where Rome's understanding, the Flavians' understanding of Judaism would have come from, is they had, highly developed Jewish intellectuals who were financially entwined with Rome that were on their particular payroll. Mm-hmm. And so this was where sort of this understanding, this deep understanding of Jewish scripture came from that ends up in the Gospels. This would have been the group that would have helped the Flavians in the production of the literature. And the other family they were aligned with was the Herods. The Herods were the tax collectors of the area around Judea. These three families are thick as thieves. The Herods, the Alexanders, and the Flavians, they intermarry. They appear as a group at the same imperial courts. They know each other very well, and they are all working together militarily against the Messianic movement.
Hmm.
So these three families then, after the war, they would have realized that, look, we've defeated the Messianic movement, but this was just a battle. Obviously, there's going to be, more rebellions. When the rebellion broke out in '66, this was simply one of a series of rebellions that started in the year one and actually didn't conclude until the year 135. So it was over 135 years of rebellions against the Roman Empire. And the Roman Jewish War, where the temple is raised, was simply right in the middle of it. So the Flavians would have been looking for some way to basically tone down the Messianic movement so it wouldn't rebel against the empire. And this was kind of the basis for, the character Jesus Christ. He's sort of a metrosexual Jewish Messiah.
Hmm.
He's cosmopolitan. He's pro-Roman. He's saying, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. He's quasi-pacifist, and he's very critical of Jews when they're just too fundamentally religious, and they don't see the broader perspective. So
Hmm.
he's just this perfect messianic character to try to calm down the messianic rebellions against Rome. It didn't work very well. I think that Rome was taking a really long view with the religion. It certainly didn't stem the flow of rebellions that the Jews created against Rome. But the Christian religion, was more than just a way to calm the Jewish people. Flavius Constantine, has the same name as the creators of Christianity, and has a lot of archaeological linkages to them. He makes it the state religion in 303, 305.
Hmm.
He says we need this state religion, but whereas Constantine gets a lot of accolades because they say that he took civilization from paganism into Christianity, as though that is some kind of worthwhile move. But
Right.
he's given that accolade. But the fact is, people forget that he actually created another system. It wasn't just making Christianity the state religion. He also created what's called the feudal system. He developed what we know of as the serfs, the slave class. And when you look at it from that perspective, you can see that Christianity was just a mind control operation. The idea is that, if Caesar tells you to give up your children and your food that you've created to the magistrate, people might rebel. But when the individual is a priest who has a religious basis for it, they're just easier to control.
Hmm.
And so Constantine created the feudal system, and then he used Christianity basically as just the mind control religion so that people would have a less kind of intellectual capacity to rebel. And it worked terrific. I mean, the system stayed intact for almost 1,500 years.
Can you talk a little bit about how you kind of uncovered the puzzle? Because you've got to go back into it, and you have to understand these techniques. You talk about typology. That'd be great to
Yeah.
define for the audience.
Okay.
Intertextuality, reading the texts, together at the same time, and the comparison and the contrast, the
Right.
parallelism.
Well, okay. So basically, the Gospels are a typological representation of the military campaign of Titus Flavius, and um, I had no idea about kind of the Hebraic technique of typology when I started my study. I just
Mm-hmm.
tried to read closely Josephus and the Gospels, and it just sort of occurred to me that these certain events just seemed strangely parallel. And then I had this kind of aha moment where I saw the sequence. But after that, I started, to look for, well, what exactly is the genre that I'm dealing with? And as it turns out, there's just an obvious and well-known primer of the typologic system that extends throughout the entire Gospels, and it's right at the beginning, the very first page of the Gospels, and it's just contained in the pre-ministry that Matthew describes. Okay, so in that story, Joseph has a dream. He leaves. He goes from Judea to Egypt, You have the slaughtering of the innocents, um, and then when he's there, someone comes up to him and he says, they who sought the child's life are dead. So then he goes back to Judea. You have a baptism. Now, at this point, Matthew describes Jesus going into the wilderness for 40 days, right? And then you have the three temptations. Jesus is tempted, he says, you do not tempt by bread, you don't tempt God. And well, where does that story come from? Well, it's typology. It's completely developed out of the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, you have Joseph, the dreamer of dreams. He's in Judea. He goes down to Egypt. If you start working through the storyline, you'll see now you have the slaughter of innocents. It's not Herod, but it's Pharaoh. You have the slaughter of the innocent children. And then someone comes up to Moses and he says, they are dead. They who sought the child's life are dead. Now you return, you have a geographical movement back from Egypt, back to Judea, and you have the baptism of the Israelites. They pass through the Red Sea. And then they go into the wilderness not for 40 days, but for 40 years. You see, typology is not verbatimism. You just have enough information that are parallel so you can see the relationship between the stories. But then you have the three temptations by God from the Israelites, and they use the exact quotes. They actually, the statement that Jesus makes are actually quotations. They're the exact words from the Old Testament. And so you have it's all pretty straightforward. In particular, notice that the geography, the traveling back and forth is exactly the same sequence, right? But you have this one, people say, well, what about this baptism? This doesn't look just right. Like Jesus, he's a single guy, he's dunked in the water, where the Israelites, they pass through the Red Sea. How is that a baptism? Well, to make sure that it's understood that Jesus is representing the event that the Israelites go through, you have a verbatim line. The author says, out of Egypt I called my son. And this was the statement that God made to the Israelites, you see. That ends up in the story about Jesus. So that shows you that, wait a second, this is basically, it's the baptism of Jesus is a typology. It's related to this going through the water that the Israelites do. So that system, you have a system where you have parallel locations, you have parallel names like Joseph, right? You have parallel concepts, okay? Going into the wilderness, the temptations, and you have it's all occurring in the same sequence, right? So you lay the stories. Okay, so it's a very straightforward way to recognize where the story came from in the Gospels. The author developed it out of the Old Testament. Now, if you go forward from the fishing for men in the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus gets his disciples together and he says, don't be afraid, we're going to fish for men. If you then just start at that point, which is exactly at the end of that first system, and then go forward, now you're just linking into Josephus. It's exactly the same system. Parallel names, parallel physical locations, parallel concept, all occurring in exactly the same sequence. So the author doesn't switch genres. He just goes into the future with Jesus instead of, looking back to the past.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then there's also the naming of the names, the recurring names. I thought that was a pretty big deal that you kind of came across. That, I mean, it seemed to me like the whole thing actually was that you read the Gospels, if you read them all separately, the stories are different. They don't necessarily make sense. You talk about learning how to read these intertextually. So you're combining, you're looking at it as one story, then comparing it to the Josephus story. Then you can start to really see these parallels, but then everything falls into place. Like, oh, now it's starting to make sense. Can you talk a little bit about the recurring names, like the recurring names of Mary, the recurring names like John and Simon, who were leaders of the Jewish rebellion, who then show up in the gospel?
Right.
The name Judas.
Yeah, once you've got it worked out, you can see that the disciples are also cutouts. They're, particularly the leaders, John and Simon. And so John and Simon are basically representations of the military leader. These are the two leadership apostles of Jesus Christ, but they're also the leaders of the Messianic movement in Josephus. And once you have the storyline dialed in, so you can just go forward, you can come to the end of the Gospels. John 23, is it 21? And you can see that Jesus, he gets the two disciples and he goes, Simon, he calls him Peter because he has a nickname for him. And that's part of the magic, is they change the name, so it's a little bit harder to see the parallelism. But, he goes, look, Simon, when you're old, you're going to get taken where you don't want to go, and you're going to be bound, and then you're going to be given to death to glorify God. And Simon goes, okay, well, what about this guy? And he says, the author of the Gospel of John. So he's John, and he goes, well, he says, it's nothing to you if he remains till I get back. Don't worry about this. So then at the end of the Roman-Jewish War, you're following along with these, once you have identified who the characters are, now at the end of the Jewish War, this is exactly what happens. Simon gets bound, he gets taken where he doesn't want to go, which is Rome, and he's given a death in the Roman city, basically as a way to honor the Roman god Vespasian. And the character John, the disciple John, he is given life imprisonment. So this is the kind of explanatory power that that occurs once you've kind of dialed in the two stories, because no one had a clue as to why Jesus would make these kinds of predictions. I mean, why would he spare John and condemn Simon? It just seemed arbitrary. There's no real reason for this. Mm-hmm. If you look at the literature, there's, hundreds of thousands of pages that people would write these conjectures and speculations and all this kind of weird stuff about, well, was this or that? Well, how about it's just that he's the author is aware of what happened to Simon and John at the end of the Roman-Jewish War. And, here's the thing, is you've got all of these events from the Roman-Jewish War in the Gospels, right? You know that when Jesus predicts the encircling of Jerusalem with a wall, he's talking about the Roman-Jewish War. When he's talking about the razing of the temple, he's talking about the Roman-Jewish War. When he's talking about the crushing of the Galilean towns, man, it's the Roman-Jewish War. This is the only time these three things ever happened, Roman-Jewish War. So that's what he's talking about. So now when you come to this, well, okay, he's condemning Simon and sparing John, it's not some kind of leap of interpretive fantasy to say, well, it's just another event from the Roman-Jewish War. You see, this is what it's kind of almost, it's like the stuff I show is so obvious once you have it, just have this kind of perspective that the question is why hasn't this always been the way people have understood it? It just doesn't, to me,
right.
it just makes no sense, because look, I'm sorry, it's the same story, and here's all the events are the same events. So, and then it's like you come to the crucifixion scene, and Jesus has this crucifixion scene where there's these three guys, and Jesus gets taken down and by Joseph of Arimathea, and then he survives, right? Okay, so now if you go to the internet, you can Google like Joseph Bar Matthias, takes the relationship between that, and Jesus' story. In other words, I showed that there is this parallel where Joseph Bar Matthias, as opposed to Joseph Arimathea. Remember, it's typology. It's never verbatim. There's always like one or two letters different, but it's exactly the same word. And he goes, so in the Josephus story, he sees three guys, that are being crucified. He goes to Titus, just like Joseph Arimathea went to Pontius Pilate, and he goes, Titus, you're the Roman commander. Can I take these guys down from the cross? And he goes, sure. So they take him down, and he miraculously survives. Now, this is like almost ludicrous, right? It's just absolutely ludicrous that people would not think that in a story that has all these other events about from the Roman Jewish War, that this story would not be the basis for the gospel story. because the name of the guy who takes him down from the cross is literally, out of like 18 Greek characters, there's only two that are different. So it's got to be the same guy.
Hmm.
And particularly once you place it in the sequence, you go, well, this is where the crucifixion story is going to be. And this is what I was going to say is that, so now it's a big deal on the internet. That one little parallel is kind of like, even now in divinity schools, I get emails and people asking me to explain this or that about it, And like one thing they go, well, no one had ever seen this. How did you see it? And I always go, guys, I saw it because I knew where to look.
Yeah.
It's not like I'm some kind of like readership genius or something. I have the book and I got the story of the crucifixion and I look over here and I go, okay, well, this is obviously the same story. So it's just, I make light of it because I'm always in these like deep scholastic skirmishes with other scholars. But frankly, I hate to say it. I mean, I do, but it's just once you get into the rhythm of the thing, it's just obvious. And it's almost, it's sad because so many people have bought into the story, over 2,000 years. It's very sad. All these people whose lives have been diminished because they had a faith that was based on something that was obviously untrue. But on the other hand, I'm hoping, that now that the information is out over time, that we can just be free of this myth. And hopefully, the lesson of oligarchic propaganda will sink in, and then there become a more effective democracy because we'll have this information.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had a teacher you just reminded me, I had a teacher in college that taught Socrates more like he was telling a joke. Not that he wasn't actually engaging in this logical argument with his interlocutors, but that he was really kind of teasing them because, they were so arrogant as to think that their logic really was that powerful at all. And it reminded me of that because as I spent some time with this teacher studying Socrates, and once you got the joke, then it became really obvious. And I think that's just what happened to you, is that you got the joke here. I mean, the Romans were kind of joking when they put out on one level. So, that's the other thing about it, is that then there's multiple levels here. I mean, the construction of the whole thing is genius. It really is.
Absolutely. It's an incredible literary accomplishment. And they meant it to be that. In other words, it was a vanity piece for sure.
Yeah.
But there is like a very very witty, but vicious kind of humor that runs through the whole thing. It's kind of like an Abbott and Costello punchline stuff. I mean, it's like Jesus sort of plays a straight man where, and you see, to really get the humor, you've got to go and see, how the typology, that the Flavians are creating with the Gospels, what they're actually mocking. They're mocking the kind of typologic prophecies that were inspiring the Jews to rebel, that you can see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, things like the Habakkuk Pesher. Now, so what they do. The Messianic movement in the first century, they would look in their ancient texts, and then they would try to see parallels to the present day, and then that would give them an understanding of when the Messiah was going to show up or when some kind of military victory was possible. They were looking for patterns, right? When at the beginning of the Gospel of John, they talk about, in the beginning there was logos, right? The logos. This is the word just gets massively misunderstood. It really comes from Philo. It's the Flavian understanding of the term. And he's talking about the divine pattern. This is what the logic is. It's divine logic. So that this was what the Jewish kind of typology was looking for, but failed, right? They got crushed. Whereas the Gospels is the manifestation. In other words, when Jesus makes these predictions and says God is going to do all these bad things and all this stuff is going to come to you, and then his life is a virtual, based upon the pattern of the military campaign, this is logos, you see.
Right.
The logos is the relationship between Jesus and the military campaign. And the idea is that always existed. The divinity of Rome is like eternal. It goes back in times and forwards, and the logos is basically just a word to describe that.
Yeah, I mean, you think about the concepts like we are the light of Rome, or being a part of the Roman Empire was this great thing, and the Caesars took this very seriously. That this was culture. We have dominated these other cultures, and I think, as you said, our logos is superior.
Yeah.
And it's not just, do I think logically, but it's also our place in history as the superior culture that is now the empire. You know what I mean?
Exactly right. And see, this was a religious position,
Mm-hmm.
or at least that's how they sold it. Was that they had this thing called the imperial cult, which basically worshipped the Caesars as divine. It was a massive bureaucracy. It was the largest government apparatus in the empire. If you go to Ephesus and look at like the temple that Domitian, Vespasian's younger son, created, I mean, you've got his hand is like 10 feet high. I mean, it's just they're just these representations of their divinity are everywhere, and that they thought was good governance. They just thought that the more they could sell themselves as divine, the easier it was going to be for the people to obey them. And then they would argue that this will make for a better world because you see, once you have the logos in place and everyone is obedient, there's no more rebellions, then we'll be much better off.
Yeah.
So that was how that was what I think they actually believed, but that's certainly what they tried to sell to their subjects.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting then when you hear Jesus saying things like repent and you will find the kingdom of heaven. What he's saying is, stop fighting the Romans and
Yeah.
become part of Rome. And this is
Sure.
the kingdom of heaven right here on earth. Just stop.
Yeah,
And
and that also worked in the feudal system, to the serf. They would, people couldn't even read, but they would go to church and this stuff would get read to them. And then the idea is you'd have a worker's paradise once you die, if you obey the magistrate.
I wanted to bring up with you, and since you just said those words, the workers' paradise, I was wondering if you've if you've thought about connecting that with, like, say, Marxism or cultural Marxism or this movement that's happening today as created. I know that the work that you and Jan have done have been more about the idea of modern primitivism and kind of bringing this back. And I definitely want to talk about that. We've got about 15 or 20 minutes left, so we can maybe get into this now. But I was wondering if you thought, that workers' paradise notion, if there was any connection between Christianity and Marxism in this kind of way.
100%. I mean,
Yeah.
Marxism is just a Christianity minus Roman bureaucracy and the God. It was just another workers' paradise. I actually did an interview on REN Network, Russian TV network, and I said, look,
Interesting.
I said, I just want to, I told it was a strange thing because they had a crew here, but there was a guy in Moscow on Skype, and he was, kind of fiddling, and it was hard to kind of, make myself clear through all that. But I said, look, I really want to say something. I said, look, what's so important, the one thing I really want to get on the record here is that the Russian people were sold a bill of goods with Marxism. It wasn't a bad economic system. It was a method to create political control. That's all it was. And if there's any vestige of like faith in that kind of, system, you have to lose it because basically it was just a piece of sophistry, just like Christianity is. It's just something to fool you so that you give up political control. And once you do that, you better be sure a genocide is going to follow, because the people that are using this, to get you to give up political control, they definitely have a different kind of, population in mind in the long run. And so, that was I wanted to be sure that kind of the anti-Christianity thing that they wanted to talk about didn't overshadow the fact that I think there's a real practical meaning toward the people today that are still suffering, from the effects of the people that sold them Marxism and Bolsheviks just so they could slaughter them, years later.
Well, I just think it's amazing too that so many people, because Marxism is what you and I perceive as the secular version of Christianity, so many people see Marxism as the antidote to patriarchy right now. And I'm trying to, I'm having conversation. I mean, I live in Northern California, and so there's a lot of people that are attracted to this kind of cultural Marxism, and they're doing it because they think that they're fighting for, people's rights and equality, and fight the power, fight the patriarchy. And I'm just saying, God, this is the new boss, same as the old boss, right? I mean, let's get real about this. This is just a secular version of the same patriarchal philosophy that was used as a psyop against the people 2,000 years ago. So, what's the deal?
Absolutely. I mean, if you trace Marxism into what's called cultural Marxism, if you go from, the Marxists that were, basically setting up the Comintern, during World War One, they realized Gregory Luchas, was one of the premier intellectuals. They said, this Marxist inevitability of the proletariat revolution doesn't look like it's going to come about, or at least it's really going to be a hassle to bring about. We need another approach. And so they switched gears and they decided to take the long march through culture. So they wanted to basically shatter cultural institutions, shatter basically just sort of European Christian culture. But you see, you have to remember that they are not altruists. They are individuals that want power for the same reasons that the Caesars wanted power. They want to
absolutely,
rule.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the thing, is that whenever someone comes to you, and just because of our history, I think this is a clear, good habit to have. But when someone comes to you and say, look, I've got a workers' paradise down the road, you just have to give up political power to me right now.
Right.
When that happens, you just tell them to go to hell and say, I'm sorry, but just because of the fact that we've been slaughtered, like people talk about the 20th century. The 20th century was basically the Holocaust of European civilization. I mean, there was, one of the studies I try to do is try to figure out, well, how many Europeans died from war and war-related events in the 20th century? You can't even get within like 20 million people. I mean, the difference, that's how many there was slaughtered. It is just vast. There's a rounding error, it's like 5 million people. And you see, my point is, look, we just have to shift gears in terms of the scrutiny we have and the relationship we have to the politicians, because this has been such a catastrophic failure. I mean, just, the history of it doesn't get mentioned a lot, but when you're looking at over 200 million people in the last 120 years being killed, I mean, this is a real problem. And so we really need to develop a little more skepticism. We need to have basically some tools, some intellectual tools, so we have a more effective democracy. And, the first thing is we just have to never believe the so-called workers' paradise that we will have eventually once we give up our political power. And so the thing is that the modern socialists, I mean, I personally have no trouble with them. I think a lot of the ideas are good. Certainly understand the concern they have about the development of the 1/10 of 1% in the United States. I mean, obviously that system is on its way to, basically an extermination of most of the population. So we have to try something. But I would just say that we should look into our own selves for, kind of systems that will work. We can't really look into history. Nothing in history has anything to offer us. All of this stuff has been, created for the gains of the oligarchs. Cultural Marxism wasn't created because it was going to make the people any better. Christianity wasn't created, it was going to help anybody. The Marxist Revolution didn't really have anything in mind. The French Revolution wasn't something that was going to take anybody to a better place. The Civil War wasn't fought to free the slaves. I mean, look, these are just population culling processes. And to make a more effective democracy, it's like I always... like I get involved a lot in discussions about the Middle East, because the Book of Revelation, seemingly has this Middle East war, that's going to bring back Jesus, and people ask me for comments, and I go, well, look, I said, in terms of politics, the first thing I look for in a politician is someone that wants to postpone the apocalypse. You see, and the idea that they're embracing it, is like, no, I'm sorry, not my guy. I'm looking,
Yeah, right.
I mean, this is what I'm looking for. Somebody like when Trump gets on there and he talks about, we've got to go and kill terrorists. I mean, I'm sorry. This is just too, it is just without any kind of real context that I can understand. And it just looks to me like it's just another way to slaughter, populations that the oligarchs don't like.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just very desirous of a higher quality of democracy, where the citizens get to push in a little bit more than we have so that, we can have some control. I mean, we wanted Obama because he was going to end the wars. Trump was talking about how, the wars were too expensive, and yet the wars never stop, So yeah. I'm looking for something else, and I'm just very, I want to see the people, to use an expression, push forward.
Right. What do you see is going on now then? I mean, because there's so many parallels between the fascists and the communists fighting each other, and I'm just astounded. I feel like this has almost come out of nowhere, and I definitely feel like there's some kind of grand manipulation going on, like once again, or, maybe it's just never stopped. I mean, it seems like there is this oligarch class. They learned from the Roman Caesars. These guys are the guys that have been studying how the Romans did it 2,000 years ago, and they're applying it today. And so, I guess we've got about 10 minutes left, but I mean, we can really kind of get into this. So how you talk about in Caesar's Messiah, like the satire is like a cruel joke that the upper class or the sophisticated class are the ones in the know. They're the ones that are educated and they know about the joke. And so they're reading the New Testament and they're reading, the wars against the Jews, and they're laughing all the way to the bank because they know this is the tool that they're using to co-opt Judaism, to co-opt this messianic form of Judaism that was such a thorn in their side, and then to soften it and turn it into a tool or a weapon that they can use. But they're peddling it to this slave class that doesn't know what the heck's going on, that it's a psychological operation basically. And exactly. I see the same thing happening today, the kind of manipulation, the social engineering that's going on. And the people really I don't know how to solve the problem even. I mean, I'm trying to do this podcast, I guess, you're writing your books.
Well, and this ain't Doug. I mean, I've like caught a couple of the ones you've done. I think they're absolutely excellent. And you are to be commended, sir. And I just, whatever I can do to support, let me know. But I mean, basically the oligarchs, they have this one trick, which it just works every time. And that is they control the media. Mm-hmm, and therefore our understanding of history is unfortunately just controlled so that we end up always hurting ourselves. We never get the fact that, I would tell people about Hillary and Trump. I go, look, they're obviously controlled by the same group.
Right.
I mean, look, if you're an oligarch, you can't have any power if you just control one political party. This is absurd. You have to control both parties. And I say the reason, I said, if you look at Hillary and Trump, they were developed, their personalities were developed because they create hatred, in massive hatred from the people who don't like them. You see, this creates the impression that there's democracy because you hate Hillary or you hate Donald.
Right.
Hillary is the cultural Marxist librarian from outer space. Donald is the, pussy-grabbing billionaire white racist. So you hate them. And because you hate them, then you have passion. But you see, in a good puppet show, the drama is what keeps you from seeing the strings, you see. But believe me, they are the same. It's the same party. These issues, feminism, same-sex bathrooms, I mean, all of this stuff is nonsense. There's two issues. There's war and money. This is what the oligarchs have, control over. And what they do is they give us fake histories. Christianity is a fake history. The stuff that the Marxists were selling is fake. And I mean, you probably can't see this, but this is like one of my favorite fake tools. This is a note from
Right.
this is a note from the interim government that led to the collapse of Russia. Okay, so the Tsar collapses, but there was an interim period, right?
Uh-huh.
And in the middle of the note, this is 1917, they indented, you can barely see it. I'm not sure you're going to be able to make it out, but you may be able to. There is a swastika in the middle of it.
Oh,
And it's
wow.
been rotated to the, perfect Masonic 45-degree angles. It's right facing, it's
Yeah.
rotated in the right way. And this is supposedly the workers' paradise Bolsheviks, right?
Yeah.
This is okay. So the thing is, the symbols that they understand, right, and control, they understand the truth that it's a way of, like, I guess it's a kind of humor they have. But when you look at these characters that develop intense hatred or heroism or feminine this, I mean, I'm sorry, we
Yeah.
don't control our history, we don't control our media. you know um, I don't know if you ever heard of Ewan Cameron, but
Mm.
he was the most insane MK Ultra psychiatrist that there was. He
Okay.
was the one. He would take women. He would he would put them into chemical comas for 30 days and give them electroshock, and then he would wake them up and give them more electroshock to what's called psychic driving, so they couldn't remember their own children. And then
Wow.
he would try to create a brand new soul, a brand new personality, right? He did this hundreds of times. There were deaths, fatalities. He got caught. The Canadian government basically helped organize a lawsuit where the CIA have confessed, and they go, oh, yeah, we were worried about this or that. And okay, this happened. But okay, so this guy is completely insane. He has the moral perspective of a lizard. But you see, this is the thing. When World War II ended, they needed someone to come in and create a narrative about the German people, right? Who's going to be the psychologist they're going to get to come in and write the history of, like, and so it was Ewan Cameron. This is the guy. They
Wow.
bring him in and he goes, the German people are completely nuts and they've got to be under, like, strict psychological control for, like,
Right.
generations. But you see, this was when he was the head of the World Psychiatric Organization. This was before the MK Ultra stuff comes out.
Yeah.
So this is the thing, is that I just wanted to, when you get in, once you start seeing, well, Christianity is a fake history. This whole thing about Jesus, he's like in our mind, he's walking around, we see him and this, that. We're just humans are easy to program, easy to code, and if you have control over the media, and so forget about history, worry about yourselves, your family, the connections, the people you have. Try to develop thinking skills, so that
Mm-hmm.
clever arguments like this don't knock you off and you end up, voting for Donald or Hillary.
Right.
It's like, it's just, these people are ludicrous. They are
I
not real humans.
I can't believe that people vote Republican or Democrat at all anymore. I just can't believe it. It's
Yeah.
like, if you want to participate in the vote third party or find, but you got to know at this point. I mean, the Democratic Party with Bernie Sanders, oh my God,
Yeah.
stop. And the Republicans did it to Ron Paul 4 years ago. Almost exactly the same. The media wasn't mentioning him. He was
Yeah.
having 20,000 people at his rallies.
Well,
I think the
we need
proof is there. They
we need
stole
to
it from
create new
him.
candidates. We need a new political party. I mean, what I tell people is, I say, look, what we need are coffee tables. Don't no violent protests. They will know how to deal with that. What they cannot deal with would be 50,000 coffee tables at every farmer's market and outside the malls, and it's
Yeah.
just a little, two guys just saying, hey, look, First Amendment, we're just here to try to talk to the people on the street. And, like, we got some information here about how one crazed oligarchic nightmare controls both political parties and they're crushing all of humanity. Right.
Right.
Here's what we have to say. We just want you to remember that when you think about this political system,
Yeah.
just remember that it's just controlled tip to stern by the same little group of insane oligarchs. So if you have that information and that gets out, then people can go, well, you know what? Maybe we should look at a new political party. Maybe when you read about, well, the DNC is like circumventing Sanders because they want to promote their gal. We just say, okay, we're not going to play in that game anymore. We can't win that game. We don't own that system. The idea of having any alliance, or enthusiasm for Republicans or Democrats, this is self-defeating. We need a new party, brother.
Well, I can't believe it. I mean, it's exactly what you're saying. The divide and conquer, the amount of hatred they've been able to generate. I mean, I am by far, I am no Trump fan, but I can't believe the stuff I'm hearing from people. Like, what? I mean, I don't, why they just hate him. They hate him more than they hated Bush.
And
Bush
was
a Nazi.
The more they are the victims of the mind control,
Yeah, right.
And
Absolutely.
That's the saddest thing to see, is that they have just been so confused that the character they have created has been effective. And you now believe what you're seeing is a real human in action, and you are outraged. Your sensibilities are being challenged. Mm-hmm. Look, just go back to my statement. If you're an oligarch, you cannot have any power by controlling one party. You've got to control both. And I remember when Obama came to office and people were saying, oh my God, this is terrific. He has an Arabic sounding name. He's half black. He's going to end these crazy wars, and we're going to see the bankers brought to heel.
Yeah.
Because he's a man of the people, right?
Right.
I mean, I said, no, I don't think so. I think if you look into his mother's background, you're just going to find nothing but the CIA and John Dewey and the same oligarchic system. I said, he just stinks. This is going to be horrible. And of course, now, you can see, well, the wars never stop. The bankers never stop stealing. And the middle class is getting more and more crushed. There's more political impotence for all of us. The NSA, the snooping technology keeps expanding.
Right.
And so, the citizens, we just need a better democracy. We got to find a way to break the grip that the oligarchs have over what we call politics. We have to start by just saying, I just am not going to be outraged at Trump or at Hillary. These are puppets. They're there to make us emotional, right?
Right.
Forget that. Grab a coffee table, get some understanding of the oligarchic system of how one group controls both sides. Get to the farmers markets. Get to the malls, and just say, here, I'm just here, First Amendment, and I want to talk, and try to develop, because, we have tools now, because we have the social media, which of course they have developed to control us, but we can flip on its back and use to organize ourselves. We could create a large political party very quickly. I know they'll try to infiltrate. I know there's a million things that can go wrong, but man, we got to try something. And this would be something I would recommend, is let's just use the media in the way you're doing.
Yeah.
This is the way. It's just to try to organize it. Always organize. Always develop more connections, more ways of expanding to more and more people, and be bold. For God's sakes, no time for timidity. We got to try something now, because with the technologic snooping capacities, they're basically going to be able to, use the iPhone to reach into our brains pretty soon and start controlling our thinking. So
I have found the most difficult thing is this left-right paradigm. I mean, this divide and conquer strategy, because people want to choose a side, and they want to hate and they want to fight. I mean, I think what we're seeing in Charlottesville right now, everybody just wants to fight, and it's, trying to take a step back and say, hey, they're manipulating all of us with this stuff. Let's try something completely different, and not
the Charlottesville
get together.
Thing was it was pathetic. I mean, if you see the photograph they released of the car going into the crowd, you'll see like a couple guys cartwheeling in the air. It looks Photoshopped to me, but one thing that just cracked me up was the license plate on the car. It's 1111.
Yeah.
See, this is their 911. I mean, they just have these number things, because the tree of life is a very key thing in their theology. So they love number puzzles and stuff, and they it's predictive programming, where they they'll have an event, but then they'll use numbers to say, well, look, hey, it's God's work, right? It's logos. It just happened on this day by accident, It's like, but it's just how they want to do it. We just ignore all that stuff, forget it. We just have to work among ourselves to create a political party that has connections that to ourselves, that has really clearly defined goals. I mean, no war, reduce the military budget, reduce the snooping, have an expansion of the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment, no more groping in the airports, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
We just have to stop. We have to start moving away from being slaves in a technological box back to where we have, rights of citizens and political power.
Well, I can't agree with you more, Joe. We're looking at a little bit over an hour here, so we better wrap it up. I think we could probably keep talking for hours.
Yeah, I know.
Hours.
Well, I hope we do, Doug. I hope we talk. Anytime you want to talk, just give me a call out, because it's just really important, that that we start to organize, connect with each other. I mean, the issues. There's a lot of different disagreements. Obviously, people are so different, but we can rally, I think, around the idea that we don't want to be slaves.
Right.
So let's just keep that in mind.
Let's do that. I know. Yeah. Is it that hard to get together when this is what's at stake? Black, white, gay, whatever. It's like, come on, let's just,
I know. They say this is what I wish I could have talked. I don't know to what extent, like in Charlottesville, the people there are being manipulated, but I would love to talk to, if there were actually Ku Klux Klan guy and the Antifa, the left-wing guys, and I would have just said, guys, look, I know it's a hard thing to grasp, but you're being manipulated.
Yeah.
This is a gladiatorial pit, and you are the gladiators.
Yeah. Right? Bread and circus.
This is bread and circuses. Right. And you are the entertainment,
Yeah.
And just try to, as best we can, work with these people to see that let's not fight among ourselves, right? We have got a real problem right now. And so let's try to cooperate.
Yeah, it's so important. Well, I really want to thank you for your work. What Caesar's Messiah does is it connects this whole thing back for 2,000 years. There's a lineage of this kind of behavior by the upper class, by the elite class. It really is a cosmic joke that they're playing on all the rest of us. And the sooner that we wake up to what's going on, I think the easier it'll be to start working together, doing what you're talking about, cooperating, getting beyond this need to fight each other over, this difference or that difference, and talking so often about these red herring issues that aren't even real issues. I think everybody's on board. Well, like you say, let's just not be slaves anymore. How's that? How about ending these never-ending wars? Everybody agrees with these basic principles. So, let's just
80% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
You've got to have both married people working like full time. No one can have a kid. Look, in 1950, before all this technologic advance, there was enough wealth in the country that a guy could have a regular job and could have a house with a wife who would stay at home and watch the kids.
And everybody's going to college and everybody has health care.
Right. What happened?
Right.
So that's the kind of stuff we got to remember. Is just this big picture stuff. Is that let's not go down this path any further. Let's try to turn it around and have a more. I hate to be like a cheerleader, but I do feel strongly about this, and hope that whatever value my work has, that it is focused in this area. That it's like people realize that, look, they give us these fake stories, fake histories, and then they manipulate us. So let's just be skeptical, use our reason, keep our senses engaged, and don't trust anyone but ourselves. Try to make a better world.
Yeah, I hear you. Do you want to let people know where they can get in touch with you and find out more about your work?
Open guy. CaesarsMessiah.com is where you can buy the books. I have a book on Shakespeare, which shows it's the same part of the same deal. Caesar's Messiah is available there, and you can ask questions. I take emails. I try to answer at least 100 a day. joeatwill@gmail.com. Just send any questions or criticism, anything, whatever I can do to help, just let me know.
Awesome, Joe. Thanks. And I just want to let everybody know that you've been listening to The Shift. I'm your host, Doug McKenty. You can help me out by becoming a patron at patreon.com/The Shift. Find out more on the Facebook page at The Shift with Doug McKenty. Join me on Twitter at DMcKenty, or find out more about everything that's going on over here at www.theshiftnow.com. And thank you so much, Joe, for being a part of the program. And I can't wait to hear more about what's going on. We'll talk again in the future.
Thank you, brother. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Talk to you soon.
Absolutely. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.